The year is 2024, and we're reviewing a new AM4 CPU. We thought they were done with the 5600X3D last year, but they're not. So there's a 5700X3D we're looking at today. This is like a slower 5800X3D, basically. Easiest way to think about it, it's a $250 part. The 58X3D is a little more expensive. It has to be $300, $315 or so. So it's just a cheaper, lower frequency 5800X3D. And this is alongside a couple AM4 parts that AMD is making for 2024. Probably this is the actual last time they're launching any. We thought that last time too, we were proven to be wrong. Okay, so the current CPU pricing landscape looks like this. The R7 5700X3D is again $250 or so on Newegg. The 5800X3D is $308 to $315, depending on if you're looking at Newegg or Amazon. Newegg notes, quote, free DDR4. We're not really counting that today as value because we're not sure how long it'll last, and it's not available everywhere. The 14600K is about $300 these days as well. The KF is around $290, and a new AM5 platform, of course, would cost more, but the 7800X3D alone would run you about $390 or so. So that's the setup for the testing today. Let's get into a simple and straightforward review. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace, and visiting squarespace.com/gamersnexus will give you 10% off your first purchase with them. We've built a number of our own websites with Squarespace, where we list catastrophic PC hardware failures to inform subscribers of those failures. We also built our store website with Squarespace using its built-in e-commerce tools, and of course, we built a website for our CEO, Snowflake, because she demanded our audience know who really runs the show. Get to the core of your idea and spend less time on web design by signing up at squarespace.com/gamersnexus or click the link below. The objectives of our review today are mostly focused on comparing it against the 5800X3D. That's because we figure most people who are considering a 57, it's probably between the 57 and 58 for you. That's our primary subject that we're gonna be looking at. And then you all know we've been good with recommending the 5800X3D basically since it launched at this point. It's been one of the most competitive gaming chips. Of course, it faces competition from brand new builds though. And for brand new builds, it has lost some viability to new platforms. The main reason for that is simply because for people who don't already own an AM4 motherboard, and if you want new, like you're not going to try and get something cheap from Facebook Marketplace or something, then AM5 gives you the same forward-looking upgradability that existing AM4 owners are benefiting from today with this launch. So for brand new builds, a little bit of a different story where it really is worth some extremely careful consideration of building on new platforms, because you will get marooned on AM4 if you buy into it. There's still reasons to buy into it. We'll talk about that later. But this is particularly interesting for existing AM4 owners. For that reason, a lot of these charts have things like 2600, 2700X, 3600. I think the 5600X makes some appearances. So there's a lot of older parts. Not every chart contains the same CPUs, so you skim through them and see if the one you're on is there, and then you can start figuring out how much better 57 or 58 would be for you in the X3D class. Okay, the specs will help us understand where to look for performance differences. They are both 8-core, 16-thread parts. They both have 96 megabytes of L3 cache. TDP is 105 watts on both, so they're mostly the same here. The clock is where it's different. The 5700X3D has a maximum 4.1 gigahertz advertised boost clock, and 3.0 for base. The 5800X3D is at 4.5 and 3.4 for base. This is a huge swing in frequency, and it's where most of the differences will manifest. However, it's possible the equalized and high cache will still give the 5700X3D an advantage in some gaming scenarios over otherwise would be direct price competitors to it. Not over the 5800X3, that's always going to be better, but that's just because the cache can help make up for things in some applications. It depends on what you're looking at. We've seen games where it's significantly more useful than in certain applications like production workloads. So production testing today will be extremely short. We have Blender, code compile, and compression and decompression for file workloads. However, the focus is really not there. It's going to be on gaming. That's because X3D CPUs, generally speaking, for the production tests that we run at least, they don't tend to show a particularly strong benefit from that additional cache. There are workloads where it probably would show up that are non-gaming, but they're not in any of our current test suite. So what that means is a 5700X 3D is going to be worse than a 5800X non-3D, just like the 5800X 3D is normally worse than the non-3D or very close to it. So it's very rare that in our production testing, the extra cache actually matters. And so that's where we're going to focus on the gaming perspective today. All right, as for why these exist, just if you're curious, We think it's related to the same answer as the 5600X3D, which was a Micro Center exclusive launch. So it is likely that since the 5800X3D has remained a successful seller, it's still in the market, people are still buying it, it's likely that the only reason you would make a cheaper version of that as AMD at this point in AM4's life cycle is if you're still sitting on a bunch of silicon that doesn't quite clear the specification requirements to hit that, say, 4.5 gigahertz advertised boost clock and the higher base clock. And so one option would be to basically do a down bin, a lower spec, where you get most of the way there, still has the extra cache on it, and that's how a 5700X3D might be born. It's also possible that they're just from a marketing perspective trying to breathe some additional life into one last push to try and purge the market of all of these AM4 chips that are still out there, including the 5800X3D. So now they get another kind of marketing round behind it. So either one, but we think it's likely that there is some amount of supply that just couldn't hit the original spec for the 58X3D, and hence we have the 57. And regardless, it exists, doesn't really matter why we're testing it. We're going to tell you if it's worth it or not. So we'll start with the summary charts to get you a rapid recap of all of the data as quickly as possible. And this is going to primarily focus on the 57 versus 58X3D, just to establish the baseline, since probably a lot of you are familiar with the 5800X3D's performance in general. So we're just going to give you the quick percent differences, and new buyers likely will be choosing between these two as well, especially people who are still on AM4. All right, let's look at some charts. Here's a simplified summary chart of the 5700X3D versus the 5800X3D. This chart shows percent change in the direction of improvement. For time-based benchmarks, we're showing the time reduction as a percent improvement here. That's because less time is better here. It's improvement. Overall, in gaming especially, the change generally hovers around the 6 to 10% range, call it about 6 to 8% on average. Some of the lower figures, like F1 at 1440p, are capped by other components. Starfield remains CPU bound though. It just shows less scaling than other titles between these two, likely due to less reliance on pure frequency. Larger gains appear in games where the frequency is more relevant, with Final Fantasy being a great example of that. This chart is the relative value comparison. Our recent 4080 Super review goes into some of the thought process and methodology behind these. It contained a huge discussion of this style of chart. The short version is that we have a lot of reservations about these. There are limitations to their usefulness, plus they abstract away from the nuance, but for a head-to-head, they start to make sense, and the audience has really shown that you all want them. A number towards the left is indicating a reduction in the amount of money you're spending for the FPS you're getting with the 5700X3D as compared to the 5800X3D. Larger reductions are better for value. Boiling it all down, the relative huge cost reduction of the 57X3D, despite slightly lower performance, allows for a significant benefit in value. We're seeing a range of 10 to 17% reduction in USD per FPS against the 58X3D. We're still experimenting with these charts. We'll be changing the style constantly as we seek discovery of something that we feel represents the full picture, and we make no claims as to it being perfect, and in fact we don't think it is, but it gives you a pretty good quick snapshot. Our full performance charts give the fuller picture, so let's get into some of those. We'll quickly look at frequency validation of the two parts. Our recent 8000 series APU reviews proved exactly why these are necessary as part of the reviews process to ensure companies' components are running properly. Here's an all-core frequency chart of the 5700X3D and 5800X3D using Blender on all threads. The 57X3D boosts to 4 GHz and holds steady for the duration of the test. It's expected behavior that these CPUs won't hit peak boost clocks in all-core workloads. The 5800X3D ran 300 MHz faster here at 4300 for the test duration. That'll be the main reason for performance differences between them. In single-threaded workloads, the maximum frequency we measured here of any given core for the 5700X3D was commonly 4150 MHz. That's about 50 MHz over advertised, so that's great to see. The 5800X3D was about 4450 MHz. Stellaris is up now. This test looks at simulation time rather than frame rate, so the differences in real-world time and definitely feels noticeable when waiting for longer simulation processing. This is one of the tests that you might notice more than frame rate in a lot of situations. The R7 5700X3D completed simulation in 36.4 seconds on average, and that's against the 58X3D's 33.5 seconds. The result is an 8% time reduction favoring the 5800X3D here, which aligns with the frequency advantage. This game tends to favor higher frequencies more than some other games, and we're seeing that here. Considering the 20 to 21% price reduction against Newegg's current $315 pricing, and ignoring the free DDR4 promo for the 58X3D since we doubt that'll last, that's not a bad trade-off. This is actually good value in relation to the 5800X3D, which itself has historically been good value. If you went AM5 instead, the 7800X3D gives some perspective on the potential ceiling. At 29 seconds, its time reduction against the 5800X3D is 13% in this test, and 20% against the 5700X3D. The 14600K completes the simulation in 16% less time than the 5700X3D. So Intel's 14600K can definitely compete in some of these titles, but the pricing's different. We also have some older parts present. You can pause here if you'd like to look at them longer. The 2600, the 2700, the 3600, and the 3700X all make appearances, so that may be useful if you want to do an in-socket upgrade. Our Starfield results are pretty barren because the game just got a massive update. Generally speaking, we don't have a chart for this, but we did plot it, and we saw about a 30% change in performance between the prior game versions we were testing and the brand new game version that just came out. So we've wiped the data, and all the data on the upcoming chart is brand new as a result, and the results are sparse but still useful. The 5800X3D roughly equated the 5700X3D here, as evident as well from the 14900K and the 7800X3D. There's definitely CPU scaling headroom, so we're not limited on the prior generation X3D CPUs by other components. It's the CPUs specifically that are limiting us. The similarity in performance relates back to a reduction in frequency dependency in this game, at least with these updates. And given the equivalence of core specs for the CPUs, the difference is only a 3% lead for the 5800X3D. As for the 14600K, that leads the 5700X3D by about 14%, or 11% over the 5800X3D. At 1080p high, the 14900K and 7800X3D become constrained by GPU requirements, despite the 4090. The 5800X3D is about a 3% better performance than the 5700X3D, and neither of them hits the GPU ceiling. The 14600K maintains its 13% lead over the new R7 5700X3D CPU. Final Fantasy XIV's up now. In Final Fantasy at 1080p, the 5800X3D ran at 218 FPS average, leading the 5700X3D by 11%. The 7800X3D gets bound up, and this is due to something we've discussed in the past with this specific benchmark and approach, which is that there's a GPU driver overhead limitation in this particular game, where there are differences that emerge between Intel and AMD when handling NVIDIA GPUs specifically. In F1 2023 at 1080p, we don't have that problem. The R7 5700X3D ran at 410 FPS average, establishing about a 40 FPS gap between it and the R7 5800X3D. However, that 40 FPS gap amounts to about 10% advantage for the 5800X3D here. The 7800X3D on AM5 leads by 24%, and the 5700X3D ends up surrounded by some of Intel's newer parts, with the 14900K and the 14700K flanking. It outperforms the 14600K meaningfully while being cheaper at the time of writing, again at $250 to $300 between the two. At 1440p, the top results get truncated due to the resolution increase. This is expected behavior. The 5800X3D now ties with the 7800X3D, with both being limited by other elements of the platform and by the increase in GPU workload. The 5700X3D doesn't reach the same heights, but closes the gap to 3% as a result of external limitations. This is a good reminder that scenarios not exclusively bound on the CPU will show limited scaling between the high-end CPUs. Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1080p, the 5700X3D landed at 301 FPS average, allowing the 5800X3D about a 9% lead. That's in line with some of the prior results. The 7800X3D leads at 350 FPS average, with the 14900K trailing the 5700X3D and the 5800X3D CPUs here. Their cache is benefiting them in this game. Baldur's Gate 3 has also received multiple massive patches since our October dataset, and we're really happy with what the team at Larian's doing for this, because the patches are improving not just the game, but the performance. We found that the CPU performance was typically around 5% different from previously at the upper bound of the range, or it was 1 to 3%, often 2% at the lower. It just depended on which CPU it was. Because of the 5% swing and some relevant scenarios for this test, this chart contains only directly comparable data that has been run on the newest game version, and so the dataset is very limited, as it was only collected this week. But it contains the most interesting comparison. The 5700X3D's 105 FPS average yields to the 5800X3D, which itself is at 115 FPS. That's about a 9% lead over the new R7. That has the 5700X3D ahead of the 7600X for performance, and about tied with the 14600K. 7800X3D leads the 5700X3D by 23% in this test, with the 14900K 11% ahead. At 1440p in medium settings, we remain bound by components other than the GPU. This is good news for CPU scaling and means that you'd still see benefit even in this particular workload. Keep in mind that our Baldur's Gate 3 testing is in Act 3, and it's in a densely populated market area of the city, which increases simulation load on the CPU. The 7800X3D is at 130 FPS leads this chart, with the 5800X3D at 111. This leads the 5700 X3D by about 11%, and the hierarchy remains the same as before. Rainbow Six Siege validated as similar on our AMD Ryzen passes for the most part, but had changed outside of our acceptable tolerances for some Intel CPUs following recent patches and updates since October. We're removing the old Intel data as a result of this, so Intel is in limited supply on this particular chart. In Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p, the 5700 X3D held at 606 FPS average, with the 58 X3D 7% ahead at 649. The 5700 X3D ends up below the 7600X in this one, and just behind the freshly retested 14600K, but not noticeably for any human. We'll quickly look at a few production benchmarks. This section will be kept short since it doesn't change as much. In Blender, the 5700 X3D completed our frame render in 19 minutes, meaning that the 5800 X3D reduces the time to render by 4%. X3D CPUs in general don't provide additional value in this test, and in fact, they typically perform slightly worse than the non-X3D counterparts, as the frequency is more useful in this test after the core count and the thread count. You can see that in the 5800X result versus the 58X3D, and in the 7700X versus the 7800X3D. 7-zip file compression is measured in millions of instructions per second. The 5700X3D completed 90K MIPS, with the 58X3D about 5% ahead of this result. The gap here is smaller than what we saw in most of the gaming tests earlier, and is within a range where, functionally speaking, you can think of the 5800X3D and 5700X3D as the same performance in file compression work. File decompression benchmarking, the 5700X3D completed 109,000 MIPS, giving the 58X3D a lead of 5.7%. The 7800X3D pulls 20% ahead here, with the 7700X further still and benefited from the frequency change. The 5800X non-3D leads its X3D counterpart as well. Finally, in Chromium code compile, the 5700X3D required 181 minutes to complete the compile. The 58X3D used about 5% less time at 172 minutes, and the 14600K leads both of these massively with a 106-minute result and 41% time reduction from the 5700X3D's result. Predictably, the conclusion is that it's a 5800X3D but a little bit slower. Almost like the spec sheet tells us that. The way the difference manifests itself tends to be to the tune of about a 6 to 10% swing between them, and the price difference is much larger. It's choose your retailer, but at the sort of low end of the price range, it's 20% increase to go from a 5700 X3D at $250 to say about a $300 or so 5800 X3D. If you're looking at higher price stuff like $315, then obviously the gap is adjusted for that. It's not bad for value for the 5700 X3D. Now that said, if this is truly going to be a last hurrah for AM4, then and if you want to stretch it as long as CPU-ly possible, even though the 5800 X3D is sort of disproportionately expensive, I guess, kind of lightly used there, but compared to the 57, it's still worth considering it. If you have an AM4 build, say you have a 2600, 3600, you're trying to get one last push out of it. You know, if your options are going to be limited to the 5000 series, which they will be, almost certainly, pretty confident in that, and it's basically going to be 58, 57 for your best choices, the 58 might be still worth some consideration unless you are more budget constrained. In which case, that's kind of why this is just this some behind the scenes for you. This isn't actually the box for that CPU, but we're pretending it is because we didn't get a box with it. But that's where something like this comes in with a 5700 X3D. It's for the budget constrained users. What's less clear to us is whether it'd make any sense to build a brand new AM4 machine with all new parts. We would lean against it, generally speaking. And the reasoning is just that if you want all new, you're not willing to buy a used motherboard, for example, you're going to pay all new prices. And the price is going to put you under still an AM5 platform, because AM5 plus DDR5, it's an expensive combination, but you will get stuck on AM4. And remember too that all the people watching this video who are on AM4 and who are considering buying one of these for their last upgrade, you're going to be the one stuck on it, as opposed to the one making the same decision as they're making, except on AM5 in a couple years, hopefully, if AM5 works out the way AM4 did. Additionally, the 7800 X3D, the 14600K CPUs like this, they are strong performers and they're competitive with these X3D CPUs, especially depending on which application you're looking at. And so while we wouldn't necessarily recommend someone with an AM4 machine that's good go out and buy a all brand new system, we would strongly recommend that for those of you who don't have a machine right now. So that's kind of where we see it. And the 14600K, although it's a price sort of alternative to the 57, 5800 X3D, we're not considering it too much in this head-to-head comparison of the two, just because you can't socket a 14.6 in an AM4 board. So we're in a different discussion at that point where an upgrade, we're just talking the cost of the CPU and that's it, versus a new build, obviously it's everything, or most of everything at least on the platform side. So as for the 5700X3, it's really pretty straightforward. We are ultimately happy with the fact that there are still CPUs being launched for a platform that remains valid and usable, especially in parts of the world where getting some of the components kind of handed down, we'll say, allows for higher end machines at hopefully more affordable cost. But even for people who are pretty happy with their build right now, it gives you one last option to upgrade. So it's nice to see a platform being supported for 8 years. They do need to go away at some point because you need new technologies to come in. But AM4, this lifespan feels pretty good for it. So that's about 7 years of Ryzen CPUs, and they've got the extra year of the original AM4 launch. So great for reducing e-waste and great for keeping PCs affordable in a market with extremely expensive GPUs. But our conclusion is pretty straightforward. So the 5800X3D we think still makes sense. It is not invalidated entirely by this. This takes a good chunk out of the potential sales for people who are really sensitive to the price, and that extra $50 to $65 matters to you. However, we think the 58X3 mostly still makes sense as an option because if you really are just trying to get one last drop in it, then squeezing everything as possible out of that motherboard is probably worth considering with that price gap. However, the 5700X3D is a better value, strictly in the sense that it's a lot cheaper and the performance gap is really not that wide. So other than that aspect of the discussion, the only thing to really think about is new builds, and we've kind of covered that. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching as always. Hopefully that helps you make a decision, and go check out some of our videos. The past couple weeks have been insane for reviews, and we experimented with some really cool new data and charts. We'd recommend checking out the AMD APU reviews if this topic interests you, because we've got some cool stuff, some discoveries in there. And AMD's making some changes. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net and use code STAP to get 10% off. And we'll see you all next time.